Today we have some more actual history about Indian raids by Comanches, Kiowas, and other Indians in Texas around the time of the U.S. Civil War. We will hear about the Indian raids from 1858 through 1866 in a sparsely settled county northwest of Dallas-Fort Worth. This is Montague County, which even today has a population less than 20,000 people. In 1858, Montague County was on the northwest edge of the towns and settlements in Texas, and to the north it bordered Oklahoma, which was then Indian Territory. So the early pioneers of this county had to constantly be vigilant against Indian depredations. We will be reading from this book, History of Montague County, by Mrs. Fanny Potter. This book was published all the way back in 1913. In today's episode, we're going to first read Fanny Potter's short explanation as to why she wrote this book. We will then read a chapter where she discusses basic Indian traits and characteristics, and then we will hear of several of the murders and depredations committed by the Indians in Montague County. These were likely Kiowa or Comanche Indians, and Kiowa Chief Bigtree was said to be one of the chiefs involved in some of these raids. So here are the first chapters of Mrs. Fanny Potter's 1913 book on the history of Montague County, Texas. The American Republic is not leagues and furlongs. It is not wealth. It is not power. It is embodied liberty regulated by law. It is liberty resting upon organized institutions, through which society and civilization may blossom into their fullest and fairest flower. Explanation. It was the first purpose of the author of this book to write a history that would only be read in the homes of the county, but after much deliberation and consultation with those best fitted to know, it was decided to condense the work and put it in a form that could be studied as a supplementary reader in the public schools of this county, believing that such a study would tend to cultivate that patriotism which is the heritage of every American citizen, and cause our youths to look with a great degree of reverence upon the early settlers of this county. The writer makes this explanation for the benefit of those who have so kindly given the data which this book contains, that they may know why some of the smaller details are left out. The sketches of Indian depredations necessarily had to be condensed for school purposes. Alas, the poor Indian, with untutored mind, finds God in the clouds and again in the wind. But little is known of the real origin of the North American Indian. Many historians with as many different theories have undertaken to account for the presence of the Indians in the New World, but to this good hour the problem remains practically unsolved. All writers agree, however, that they are among the oldest races of mankind. After much study, all writers have much the same things to say about the Indian. As to pursuits, they rarely cared to cultivate the soil, but were truly men of the chase. To hunt was the Indians' favorite pastime. They were never more contented than in a country of forests, hills, and streams, where they could hunt the bear, deer, and other wild game. In disposition, the Indian is silent and unsocial, often answering the politest question with a grunt or nod. With all that has been done for the Indian toward their civilization by church and school, their nature remains much the same. The Indian woman, or squaw as she was generally called, was nothing more than a slave for her warrior husband. As to religion, the Indians were a superstitious race. They believed in a great spirit. They believed he ruled the elements, rewarded the faithful, and punished the wicked. They built no churches such as we have. The medicine man was looked upon with much awe and respect, and they listened to his sayings. The happy hunting ground of his imagination was his only idea of a home in the great beyond. Often the trappings of a warrior were buried with him, that he might be prepared for the continuation of the sports and pastimes enjoyed here. The Indian had a great love for war. Revenge was his watchword. To forgive, to show any sign of sympathy or regret, was considered a weakness. They were cunning and treacherous. To meet a foe in the open was not to their liking. They delighted to lie in wait and spring upon him unawares. Their especial pleasure was to torture their captives, and it was in this fiendish pastime that the real savage nature shone without reserve. His home was a wigwam. His clothing, for the most part, consisted of a blanket thrown over his shoulders, sometimes bound about him, and at other times worn as a loosely flowing robe. They sometimes wore hats to deceive the settlers into thinking they were white men. He delighted to adorn himself with beaded ornaments, to paint his face in bright colors, and more than all, he prized the scalp of the white man as an especial adornment. Dressed in this manner and with unearthly yells, did he like to descend upon an unsuspecting settler and his family, to kill and scalp them, take some captive and lay waste their home, kill their cattle and steal their horses. The great warfare between the white man and the Indian, as we all know, began when the white man determined to take from the Indian his home. Inch by inch they contested every foot of the land of their fathers, step by step, through stealth and strife, through war and bloodshed, they have been driven on by the progress due to civilization, until now, indolent and indifferent, subdued and satisfied, it is difficult to think of them as having been the warlike tribes that history describes. An early writer of the history of Northwest Texas tells us that it is doubtful if any state has suffered more severely at the hands of the Indians than has Texas. From its earliest days they were a constant menace to all efforts at civilization and permanent habitation. The name Apache and Comanche have become synonymous for ferocity and bloodthirstiness, and the worst traits of savagery. And for years the tribes of that race harassed the frontier and carried their warfare into the heart of the settlements. The history of Indian warfare and outrage in Texas would fill volumes. During the period of which this is written, the sole ambition of the Indians who raided Montague County was to steal horses and exterminate the whites. The settlers noticed certain peculiarities belonging to the Indians. If they recovered a stolen horse and it had its ears split, they knew the Comanches had stolen it. If it had one ear split and the other ear cropped, they knew the Kiowas had stolen it. They learned to look for Indian raids on moonlight nights. We of today look forward to our beautiful moonlight nights with pleasure. It is then we delight to have our moonlight socials, our protracted meetings, and to visit our friends. Not so in early days. These were nights of anxiety and dread to the settler. They observed that the fiercest dog would not molest an Indian, nor would it even bark if a large band of Indians were to surround his master's house at night. The exact cause of this is unknown. Some attributed it to fear, others thought it was due to some charm the Indian cast over the dog. The Indian was also master of the art of handling horses. He could take a horse that a white man considered tired and worn out from a long day's ride, and had exhausted all efforts to make him travel faster. The Indian could mount the same horse and by some unknown means cause him to travel equal to a fresh horse. The Indians had many forms of amusements, among them the war dance. In conducting this dance, sometimes the warriors danced alone, but frequently the women were permitted to join in the dance too. They circled around and around, meanwhile chanting the weird, monotonous songs of their tribes. These dances have been the means of attracting large crowds to many of the western towns, where on such occasions as barbecues, country fairs, etc., the Indians are persuaded to attend and give their dance for the amusements of the onlookers. They had other amusements such as wrestling, running, leaping, shooting at a mark, racing in canoes, and many other games. They were much given to the gambling spirit, and in a moment of excitement would sometimes wager all they possessed. They loved tobacco, and it has been said that no race has succumbed so quickly to the liquor habits. It was with these wild, untutored people, who gave no mercy nor asked any, that the early settlers of Montague and adjoining counties had to battle for the homes of peace and plenty we now enjoy. In the following pages will be given, in condensed form, a list of Indian depredations and their dates. Not all the counties suffered, but enough for the boys and girls of today to know and to appreciate the dangers the pioneers endured. In 1858, John Willingham and Bob Wainscott built for themselves a substantial log cabin in what was then called Buchanan Valley, but is now known as the Frank Biggers Place on Denton Creek, it being the custom in those days for 2 or more families to live together for protection from the Indians. This portion of Montague County offered many inducements for the industrious man, and as they built their home and surveyed the fertile little valley, future hopes ran high. On September 4th their families arrived. The following day being Sunday, they went to the home of Daniel Wainscott. There they found a large company, about 30 in number, assembled to spend the day. We can imagine them enjoying the hospitality of this good pioneer home. The women are busy preparing dinner as they discuss their everyday home lives. Occasionally a shadow of fear crosses their faces, and an unexpected noise causes them to turn pale, for danger may be lurking near. Their anxious looks linger longest on their little ones, and very tenderly they smooth the curly heads and kiss the rosy cheeks, and a mist comes before their eyes, as they remember that the dreaded Indian foe has no mercy on babies. But the ringing laughter of the children at play in the sunshine dispels their momentary fear, and they take up the thread of conversation anew. The men in the front yard talked of everyday affairs, and gave an occasional word of warning to the newcomers about the Indians. The day being clear and sunshiny, the entire company decided to go over to the new Willingham and Wainscott place, as they expressed it, just to pass the time. The following were in the number: Cash McDonald and family, Daniel Wainscott and family, Bob Wainscott and family, John Willingham and family, Fine McFarland, Ike Wainscott, Jack Kilgore and family. Cash McDonald drove his wagon with a yoke of steers hitched to it, and a number of the women and children rode with him, the others walking leisurely along by its side, as steers do not travel fast. Bob Wainscott and Jack Kilgore were a little in advance of the wagon, when they reached a point of timber about a quarter of a mile from the new house. Without a word of warning, 7 Indians sprang out from the woods upon them, uttering unearthly yells as they came. Seeing their approach to the house was cut off by the Indians, the men turned to run back to the wagon. Just after they reached it, both men were slain by the Indians. By this time the women and children had scattered like frightened birds, some going in one direction and some in another. Contrary to their custom, the Indians did not take time to scalp their victims, but turned their attention to the rest of the party. All members of the company managed to reach the home of John Wainscott in safety, with the exception of Cash McDonald and Mrs. Bob Wainscott. Mr. McDonald held in his arms his 2-year-old daughter, Mary, now Mrs. Andy Jackson of Bowie. He was shot in the arm with an arrow, but fortunately little Mary was unhurt. Notwithstanding this, he walked 12 miles, shunning the road for fear of Indians, still carrying the child in his arms, reaching Bill Freeman's house in the night. They pulled the arrow from his arm, which had remained there all of these hours, and was very painful. Mrs. Bob Wainscott also had a thrilling experience. In the confusion following the attack by the Indians, she became separated from her husband. Looking back, she saw an Indian shoot her husband, who fell with their 4-year-old daughter in his arms. She supposed both were killed, but the Indians passed on, and they made their way to safety. She proceeded on her way, running with her 6-week-old baby in her arms. Now Mrs. Hughes Wainscott of Denver. She came upon Mr. Cash McDonald, who, as already been told, had his little daughter with him. The child was sick and crying aloud for her mother. They could not quiet her by any means. So Mr. McDonald said, "If Mary continues to cry this way, she may attract the Indians, and they will come and kill us all. It is hard for you to start out through the woods alone, but it may be the means of saving your life and that of your baby." It was a fearful moment, but the half-distracted woman decided to take his advice, and started through the woods alone. Having just come into the neighborhood the day before, she was wholly unacquainted with the country. Her one thought was to travel in the direction of the old home she had left. On and on the terror-stricken woman went. She traveled all the afternoon and that night over stones and hollows, through briars and thickets. The next day found her between Braden's Bluff and Clear Creek, having traveled in her wanderings about 30 miles. In all this time she had eaten but 2 wild plums. About 12 o'clock that day, hungry and almost exhausted, she paused to rest for a short time near a hollow. In the beginning of her flight she had lost her sunbonnet. Her hair had become loosened and fell about her face in such a manner that her features could not be discerned without close scrutiny. A band of white men who had heard of the raid and started out to aid in the capture of the Indians came upon Mrs. Wainscott quite suddenly. Seeing her long black hair falling in Indian fashion about her face, they mistook her for an Indian squaw, and paused an instant before approaching, not knowing what might await them. She caught a glimpse of the men, and believing them to be Indians, she ran away with her baby clasped to her breast. She hid in a washed-out place in the hillside. The men found her there, and she was overjoyed to learn that they were white men. She poured out her story to them between sobs. One of the men took her behind him on his horse, while another carried the baby in his arms. They took her to the home of Mr. John Wainscott, where to her great joy she found her husband and little daughter. The remains of the 2 men who were slain by the Indians were removed to the home of Anderson White. As his house was the largest in the neighborhood, the entire settlement was invited to come there and stay until after the funerals of Jack Kilgore and Daniel Wainscott, which they accepted. The next morning they were both buried in the same grave, in what is now known as Frank Bigger's field. They had to be wrapped in blankets as there were no coffins nearer than Gainesville or Decatur, many miles away, and with the way beset by perils on every side. They laid them to rest 'neath 2 wide-spreading trees, and the summer sun shines and the winter snows fall softly upon the graves of 2 of the martyrs of civilization that we now enjoy. This was one of the first massacres by Indians in Montague County that we have record of. After the Indians left the scene of the killing of the 2 men just recounted, they came up on Mr. Bud Morris of Montague, who was out hunting cows. He was riding a fine horse. He outran the Indians and escaped without injury. The same band of Indians went on to Hardy, about 4 miles from Forestburg, and stole 40 head of horses from Dr. Pauley. Dr. Pauley was one of the pioneer physicians of Montague County. He was also the first county judge of Montague County. He is described as being a natural leader and a useful citizen. The country was so thinly settled at this time that his judicial duties in no way interfered with his practice of medicine. After the killing of Jack Kilgore and Daniel Wainscott, the people of the settlement stayed in families for protection from the Indians. Many of them packed up their belongings and moved near Gainesville to be out of reach of the Indians. They came back the following November to the same homes. Nothing had been molested and things were just as they had left them. The woods at this time were full of wolves, some bear, deer, wild cats, and panther. Wild turkey was plentiful, and it has been said that nothing was more appetizing than slices from the breast of a turkey, broiled or fried a delicate golden brown, with rich brown gravy, a hoe cake of cornbread, and a cup of steaming hot coffee. There was also an abundance of wild duck, geese, and prairie chicken, which was much relished. So the settlers had no scarcity of meat so far as wild game was concerned. On the 10th of May, 1858, there moved into the community of Victoria Peak, now known as Queen's Peak, Uncle Johnny Rowe and a man named Kreiner. They had not had time to build houses, so they were camped in tents and covered wagons. They turned their horses out to graze that night. Mr. Kreiner had a lariat rope on his horse, and Mr. Rowe had iron hobbles on 2 mares and colts. In the night, the Indians came and stole Mr. Kreiner's horse. Not knowing how to take the iron hobbles off the other horses, and not wishing to leave them for the benefit of the white men, they cut their legs off, taking the iron hobbles with them. They did not molest the campers. In a few days followed the killing by John Braden. A party of men, hearing how the Indians had mutilated Mr. Rowe's horses, started to search for them. There were 5 white men in the party, among them John Braden. When about 4 miles northwest where Montague now stands, at a place called Barrel Springs, they came up on 2 Indians with a bunch of stolen horses. In the encounter which followed, John Braden killed one of the Indians. They scalped him, and the other Indian ran away, leaving the stolen horses. Mr. Braden had an old British Jaeger, now called musket, with which he slew the Indian. He himself was killed after the war. In February 1859, Bill Davis, who lived in Grayson County, came to this county to visit at the home of his stepfather, Anderson White, who lived on Denton Creek. He brought with him his little son, Henry. They had previously known Mrs. McFarland and her children, and as they passed the house on their way to Mr. White's, Henry begged to be allowed to stop and play with the McFarland children. His father consented to this, but told him to go to Bill Taylor's about 2 o'clock, to feed and water some mules he had left there. When the hour came, Henry obediently started on his way. When about halfway there, the little fellow came up on a band of Indians. The boy, like any other child under like circumstances, started to run. The Indians gave chase, and ran him over a steep bank into a hole of water. He made his way to the opposite bank. They followed, killed, and scalped him. On this same morning, a man named Truelove had gone with a band of men to help trail a band of Indians. In the afternoon, he separated from the party and started for his home in the Perryman settlements. Without warning, he suddenly came upon this band of Indians killing little Henry Davis. He ran with all his might, crying loudly for help. As he neared the McFarland home, Mrs. McFarland ran out with a gun to assist him. Together they succeeded in frightening away the Indians that had followed him. He then told of the boy that the Indians were killing as he came up. She at once thought that it was Henry Davis. A search party went to see, and found it to be only too true. When they found him, his small, boyish face was turned toward the setting sun, his mutilated body bearing evidence of another innocent little life being sacrificed to gratify Indian cruelty. He was buried on the Wiley B. Savage place on Denton Creek, 7 miles south of Montague. In a lonely cabin near Pitman Hollow, in February 1863, lived Spencer Moore, his wife, and large family of children. Life to this good pioneer man was a stern reality. It had been a problem with him as to how he would provide for so large a family in this frontier country. Only one son, Ira, was large enough to be of any assistance to his father in the labor of breadwinning for the family. They had succeeded in getting some rails to maul from Lewis Davis of that neighborhood. On the day of which I am about to tell you, Mr. Moore and his son were busy with their work. As they worked, they talked cheerily together, for that evening Mr. Davis was going to pay them for their entire work, and that meant enough money to buy plenty of corn for bread for the remainder of the year. How the burden rolled away as the father realized that by his labor he would be enabled to provide for his dependent family in this simple though necessary way. The noise of mauling the rails could be heard quite a distance through the woods. About 2 o'clock in the afternoon, one of the neighbors, Mr. Cash McDonald, noticed that the sound had ceased. The continued silence alarmed him, for in Indian times everything of this kind was taken notice of. The silence finally became oppressive, for the ringing blows of the railmakers were not heard again. Thoroughly aroused, Mr. McDonald and others went to the field, to find their fears to be only too true. Spencer Moore and his son had both been killed and scalped by the Indians. They supposed the boy had tried to fight with his axe, and perhaps wounded some of the Indians from the quantity of blood scattered about. John Wainscott brought a wagon, and took the bodies to his house, where they remained until burial. Ike Wainscott, just a boy, but with all the manliness and kindly spirit which characterized the older pioneers, insisted that Ira be buried in his Sunday shirt. And Sunday shirts were hard to get in those days. Father and son were buried in the Denver graveyard. The good people of the community provided for the widow and helpless children. They gave her provisions enough to last a long time, and cared for her until she moved to Denton County, where she was in no danger from the Indians. It transpired that the Indians who did the killing had been raiding through Jack County, stealing horses from the wheat fields. A crowd of men determined to surprise them. It was a bright moonlit night, and the Indians could be plainly seen by the waiting men, as they rode up bent on stealing their horses. They opened fire on the Indians, wounding one and possibly more, but they were carried away by their companions, who, seeing their disadvantage, turned and fled with the white men in pursuit. They lost their trail, and the Indians stopped over in Montague County, and on their way stopped long enough to murder Spencer Moore and his son Ira. About this time there were numerous small depredations by the Indians, and the settlers were in constant dread of their coming. On a certain morning in September 1866, another band of Indians came into Montague County. They passed the fort at the head of Elm, and exchanged shots with the men stationed there. They went east about 4 miles, and killed a man named Jim Harris. The Indians then passed on in the direction of Gainesville, killing Andy Powers, a citizen of Montague County. Near there, this band was joined by another band of Indians. They passed up the ridge between Clear Creek and Elm Creek, back into Montague County, with about 500 stolen horses. Charlie Grant, with a posse of 40 men, followed them into Clay County and on to the Big Wichita River. The night before, a band of men had started from the Red River Station in pursuit of this same party of Indians. They had crossed the Big Wichita River and had a battle with the Indians, there being about 25 white men against more than 100 Indians. The white men, when they struck the Indian trail the day before, knowing that Charlie Grant and his men were coming behind, stuck a stick in the ground in a place where they would be sure to find it, and tied a note on it bearing these words, "Come on, boys, they have passed this way." The determined men pressed on, but were soon confronted by different orders. They found this message tacked on a tree on the banks of the Big Wichita River: "Turn back, boys, they have given us a warm reception." After their battle with the Indians, the whites, finding themselves to be far outnumbered by the enemy, decided to retreat. When the last party of white men came to the place where the orders were tacked on the tree, they followed the advice and returned to their homes. After the killing of Tom Fitzpatrick and his wife, and the capture of their 2 little daughters by the Indians, the father of Tom Fitzpatrick continued to live at the old home place alone. He was very deaf. One night, a band of Indians surrounded the house. They fired quite a number of shots into the house, as was discovered next day, before they succeeded in arousing the old man, who was sound asleep. When he awoke and finally decided that the Indians were attacking the house, he began firing at them. This frightened the Indians, and they turned to run. In their path was an old abandoned well, about 40 yards from the house. One of the Indians rode into the well. His horse, plunging head foremost into the well, carried his unfortunate rider with him. Some of the neighbors came next day, and succeeded in getting the Indian out. The fall had killed him. The horse was left in the well. This farm is north of Forestburg 2 miles, and is now known as the Ben Stedham Place. So that's it for this episode on some of the early history of Montague County, Texas, where the settlers faced the constant threat of Indian depredations. This was from Fanny Potter's 1913 book, History of Montague County. She wrote this book as a supplementary reader for school children, so that they could hear of the dangers that the pioneers of the county faced at the hands of the Indians. This was all the way back in 1913, but it seems to me that this type of book would still make an excellent reader for school children. This episode covered the Indian raids in Montague County from 1858 through the beginning of 1867. There are many more accounts of Indian raids that occurred in 1867 and later. So let us know in the comments if you'd like to hear about other Indian depredations in Montague County. There were quite a variety of depredations that we read about in this episode. The Indians cut the legs off of some horses because they couldn't get the horse hobbles off. They also killed little Henry Davis after he went off alone to play with the McFarland children. His body was found horribly mutilated, and he had been scalped with his head faced toward the setting sun when they found him. We also heard about Mrs. Wainscott saving herself and her infant baby by walking a long roundabout way until she was found by some other settlers, who at first thought she was an Indian. And last we heard about an Indian falling down a well, while attempting to flee from the house of Tom Fitzpatrick's father. Let us know what you think about these stories and which one is your favorites in the comments below. This channel is called Unworthy History because we cover actual history that has now been deemed unworthy to show on history channels on TV. Here on this channel, we keep this worthy history of our ancestors alive by reading directly from old books, written down long ago by people whose shoes we are unworthy to stand in. If you'd like to support our mission on this channel, then you can become a Patreon or YouTube channel member. Members will have full access to all of our members-only videos, and your contribution towards keeping actual history alive will be recognized at the end of each episode. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.